A federal judge quietly blocked a major deportation. No hearing, no transparency. That secret ruling put national security at risk until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett blew the lid off everything. What did she find hidden behind the black robes? And why are judges across America now panicking? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the kind of politician who needed a spotlight to speak her mind. Her words carried weight, with or without a microphone. Before Congress, she was a courtroom warrior, sharp, relentless, and unafraid to stare power in the eye. On a rainy Tuesday night, while scrolling through her encrypted inbox, a flagged report caught her attention. It was brief but explosive. A deportation flight carrying over 20 Venezuelan nationals, several flagged as potential cartel affiliates, had been grounded at the last minute. No mechanical failure, no weather delays. Just a one-line federal order issued by Judge Malcolm Pierce. No hearing, no review, just a decision. Jasmine froze, eyes narrowing. She knew the playbook. He didn't pause a policy, she muttered. He rewrote it. She dove into the paper trail. There had been no transparency, no public statement. The Department of Homeland Security had been blindsided. Field agents left scrambling to explain the reversal to airport security. Crockett's instincts screamed. This wasn't compassion, it was overreach. Since when does a judge get to halt a national operation without even stepping into a courtroom? She asked her aide, voice laced with fire. No one answered. They knew better. She looked out the window toward the Capitol dome, lit like a watchtower in the storm. And then she said it, quiet but cutting. No one elected him to rewrite immigration policy. The storm didn't come from outside. It was in her hands, stapled, highlighted, and falling apart at the seams. Jasmine Crockett sat in her office, the blinds half closed against the dull gray of a Washington afternoon. Her desk was no longer a workspace. It was a battlefield covered in open files, government seals, and flagged documents. She was on her third cup of black coffee, sleeves pushed up, red pen clutched like a weapon. Her eyes moved fast, trained, deliberate. Every page she read made her colder, angrier, sharper. These weren't random mistakes. This wasn't bureaucratic clutter. This was precision neglect, dressed in legal decorum. She scratched a thick red line across a report labeled, "Low Priority Risk Released." The name belonged to a Venezuelan national with prior arrest records linked to armed gang activity. No trial, no further screening. Jasmine's brows tightened. Another page, an ice-field memo warning about missing biometric reviews. Deferred, it said in the margin. Deferred, but the flight had already been canceled. And the judge? No explanation, no hearing, not even a published opinion, just a sealed emergency order sent at midnight. We're talking about 20 people, she muttered, and no one thought the public deserved a reason? Her team stood around her in tense silence. No one knew what to say. She didn't need encouragement. She needed answers. Look at this, she said, slamming one sheet on the table. They stopped a federal deportation process with an order based on partial data, not evidence, not testimony, just vibes and vague language. Her voice rose, not with panic, but clarity. Where's the judicial restraint in that? Where's the due process for the rest of us? She grabbed another file, circled phrases like expedited release and insufficient threat profile, then looked her assistant dead in the eye. This judge didn't rule on law. He ruled on politics. For hours, Jasmine dissected the case with surgical precision. She reconstructed the entire timeline. ICE flagged individuals on March 3rd. DHS authorized transport by March 10th. And then on March 11th, at 11:47 p.m., came the judge's order. Quiet, unannounced, and utterly final. Jasmine's voice dropped to a near whisper, as if the weight of the truth could crack the walls. No questions asked. No one held accountable. And they expect us to call that justice? She slammed the folder shut and stood tall. We built this government on checks and balances, not backroom rulings from invisible men. That night, Jasmine didn't go home. She rehearsed for her interview like a lawyer prepping for trial. No teleprompters, no scripts, just conviction. When the studio lights turned on, she didn't blink. The host offered a diplomatic opener, hoping to keep things measured. Jasmine didn't bite. "Let me make something very clear," she said, steady as steel. "I am not attacking the courts. I am confronting the silence that protects them when they cross the line." The screen cut to a close-up. Her tone never wavered. "I respect the robe, but I reject the myth that it makes you untouchable." And then, the line that hit the nation like a thunderclap. "I'm not afraid of judges. I'm afraid of the ones no one dares to question. Power hidden under a black robe is still power. And if we don't check it, we're not a republic. We're a ritual." The studio went silent. Across the country, living rooms, diners, and late-night newsrooms lit up. Some called her reckless. Others called her righteous. But no one could ignore her anymore. The airwaves had barely cooled after Jasmine's televised interview when the tremors began online. Her words, cutting, clear, unapologetic, were already clipped into sound bites, overlaid with bold fonts and dramatic music. Her final line, "Power hidden under a black robe is still power," became a rallying cry for some and a declaration of war for others. Within hours, Twitter turned into a digital battlefield. On one side were Americans who had long felt unheard by the justice system. Blue-collar workers, retired servicemen, single mothers, small-town mayors, people who didn't quote constitutional clauses but knew what it felt like to lose in silence. They called her the last honest voice in Washington, the people's prosecutor, and even Lady Liberty with a briefcase. A sheriff from Texas posted a clip of her speech with one word, "Finally." A viral post from a former foster youth read, "She's not burning down the courthouse. She's showing us who locked the doors." Hashtags surged. Crockett courage, judges aren't gods, reclaim justice. Someone made t-shirts. A Navy veteran in South Carolina started a GoFundMe to put her speech on every billboard in America. TikTokers remixed her words with dramatic visuals of courtrooms, gavels, and prison gates closing. She didn't ask for a movement, but she got one, and it was growing fast. But for every cheer, there was a counterpunch. From the other side came an avalanche of accusations, editorials, and carefully crafted outrage. Legal scholars condemned her as a demagogue in a blazer, warning she was undermining the very foundation of judicial independence. A prominent D.C. law professor wrote, "What Crockett has done is open the door to mob rule, where judges will soon need approval ratings instead of legal precedent." Cable news panels lit up with headlines like, "Crockett's Crusade, Hero or Hazard." Conservative outlets accused her of weaponizing public ignorance. Liberal pundits called her a leftist version of populist overreach. It wasn't about what she said anymore. It was about what people feared her words could unleash. Inside courthouse walls, things turned icy. Federal judges who once greeted cameras with stone-faced indifference now closed their doors. Some released vague statements affirming commitment to impartiality. Others remained silent, watching her like a threat they couldn't publicly name. One anonymous judge told a reporter, "This is how institutions fracture, from the outside shouting into the chambers." Back in Jasmine's office, the tension was thick. Her staff was split, some thrilled by the momentum, others unnerved by the ferocity of the backlash. She listened, eyes locked on the screen as tweets flashed by. Supporters calling her brave, critics labeling her dangerous. An aide finally asked what everyone else was thinking. "Congresswoman, are you sure we haven't gone too far?" She didn't blink. "No," Jasmine said, her voice low and unshakable. "We haven't gone far enough." She walked to the window and looked out at the Capitol. Same marble, same flags, same illusion of permanence. But something had shifted, and she could feel it in her bones. People weren't just listening. They were waking up. And once that happened, no robe, no title, no institution could hide behind old symbols forever. 3 days after the media frenzy reached its peak, something shifted. Not through a speech, not through a protest, through a leak. It arrived quietly, like most tremors do before the quake. A heavily redacted government document, stamped with confidential internal review, landed in the inbox of a journalist from a mid-tier investigative blog. At first he thought it was fake. until 3 more reporters from different networks confirmed receiving the same file. Less than an hour later, it was posted in full, stripped of its black bars by someone with clearance and a conscience. And that was the moment the entire narrative around Judge Malcolm Pierce began to crack. Inside the file were the full, unfiltered profiles of the Venezuelan nationals who had been scheduled for deportation, the same group Judge Pierce had protected from removal with his late-night injunction. According to the leaked document, 12 out of the 23 individuals were flagged as security sensitive. These weren't casual notations. One had been arrested in Panama on charges of illegal weapons possession. Another had known associations with a transnational gang involved in narcotics trafficking. A third had biometric inconsistencies linked to a false identity used during a failed border crossing years earlier. These weren't undocumented dreamers. These were men with complicated records and, in some cases, dangerous ones. Yet the most damning part of the leak wasn't who they were. It was what wasn't done. The report confirmed that Judge Pierce had issued the emergency order without ever requesting access to the classified security briefings. He hadn't asked ICE for the full profiles. He hadn't summoned a hearing. There had been no opportunity for rebuttal, no independent review, no questions asked. Just a ruling. One man, one page, one decision. That decision had grounded a federal deportation flight and allowed more than a dozen questionable individuals to remain inside the United States. And now the country knew it. The reaction was immediate and electric. News outlets that had once framed Pierce as a symbol of moral resistance began walking back their praise. Did the judge act too soon? One CNN banner read. Oversight or overreach? Asked NPR. Even liberal-leaning commentators couldn't ignore the optics. The law isn't a shield for the well-intentioned, said one MSNBC analyst. If you're making decisions in the dark, you're not defending justice. You're guessing. The media didn't have to say Jasmine Crockett was right, because the facts were screaming it now. Social media turned into a firestorm of reassessment. People who had defended the judge began to hesitate. Users flooded the platforms with side-by-side images. One of Jasmine at her desk with a red pen, circling names on leaked documents. The other a still of Judge Pierce walking calmly into a courthouse just a week before. The caption on one viral post read, "One of them asked questions, the other one didn't." Jasmine's office didn't issue a new statement right away. She didn't need to. The silence from her side said everything. She wasn't chasing headlines. She had chased the truth, and now it was staring the country in the face. But even so, not everyone welcomed the revelation. Some doubled down. High-profile law professors accused her of weaponizing intelligence leaks for political gain. A joint editorial from 2 retired federal judges warned that undermining judicial independence sets a dangerous precedent even when the facts are uncomfortable. Others argued that she had caused a chilling effect. Judges across the country reportedly began second-guessing whether to intervene in immigration cases, fearing political retaliation. Jasmine read all of it, every line, every loaded word, and she knew what they were really afraid of: accountability, public accountability. Behind closed doors, Jasmine met with her legal advisors and senior staff. The room was filled with tension, not celebration. One aide cautiously asked if this was the moment to call for Pierce's resignation. Jasmine shook her head. "No," she said, voice calm but firm. "This isn't about removing him. It's about removing the illusion that these decisions happen in a vacuum. Because they don't. They affect real people on both sides of the law." She paused, then added, "I don't want revenge. I want a reckoning." That night, Pierce's name trended again, but for a very different reason. Not as a martyr, not as a symbol of courage, but as a case study. A cautionary tale about what happens when unchecked authority meets incomplete information and zero resistance. One commentator on primetime news summed it up best. "He may have meant well, but he ruled blindly, and no robe should excuse that." And as the conversation evolved, a deeper question emerged. Not about Pierce, not even about Crockett, but about the system itself. How many decisions like this had already been made in silence? How many reports had never been read? How many orders had been signed without scrutiny, simply trusted because of the title behind the name? That was the question Jasmine had wanted the country to ask all along, and now finally they were asking it. The leak had changed everything. It shifted Jasmine from a voice in the wilderness to a woman standing in front of a burning building, pointing directly at the match. But while the public swirled in debate and reporters lined up outside Jasmine's office hoping for her next quote, another building, quieter, older, colder, was watching. Inside the towering white walls of the U.S. Supreme Court, the tension wasn't visible, but it could be felt in every hallway, in every quiet exchange between clerks and justices, in the careful way the court's public affairs director chose her words with the media. It had been years since the court was pulled into the public spotlight this directly, years since a sitting member of Congress had forced their hand. But now the silence was no longer dignified. It was conspicuous, and Chief Justice John Roberts knew it couldn't last. He didn't rush. That wasn't his style. Roberts was deliberate, surgical, a man who believed in the weight of words and the power of appearances. He read Jasmine Crockett's statements in full, not just the headlines but the transcripts. He reviewed her voting record, her interviews, her past legal work. She wasn't reckless, he realized. She was precise. And that made her far more dangerous to the institution than a provocateur ever could be. Jasmine wasn't just criticizing a single judge. She was calling into question the entire ecosystem that allowed judicial decisions to go unquestioned, unchallenged, and too often unseen. So Roberts did what he had avoided for as long as possible. He prepared a response. The morning of the speech, he arrived early. Earlier than usual, even for him. The building was still. Security nodded silently as he entered the West Wing, where his private chambers sat in solemn quiet. In his hand, he carried a single sheet of paper, folded once down the center. It wasn't long, just 4 paragraphs, but he had rewritten it 6 times over the past 2 nights. Each word was weighed, each sentence trimmed of excess, emotion, or anything that could be mistaken for concession. He wasn't there to escalate. He was there to stabilize, to remind the public and Jasmine that the judiciary still stood apart, still above the fray. At 10:03 a.m., he stepped into the court's press room. No live cameras, no spontaneous questions, just a handful of pre-approved journalists and a single government videographer. Roberts approached the podium slowly, unfolded the paper, and began to speak. The courts of the United States do not make policy. That is the job of Congress and the executive. But neither do we allow our independence to be shaken by those who mistake disagreement for dysfunction. We do not fear questions, but we do not yield to performance. His voice was calm, steady, but cold. There was no mention of Jasmine Crockett, no direct reference to the leaked DHS report, but the message was unmistakable. Roberts wasn't just defending Judge Pierce. He was defending the robe itself. The rule of law, he continued, is not a matter of volume or headlines or trending topics. It is a matter of discipline, of process, of patience. And the day we forget that is the day we lose not just public confidence, but our own purpose. He finished the speech, folded the paper again, and stepped away without taking a single question. The room stayed still for a long beat, then exploded into a flurry of pens, keyboards, and flashes. By lunchtime, every major outlet had run the story. Roberts breaks silence amid judicial firestorm. Supreme Court chief subtly rebukes Crockett's campaign. Roberts defends judicial integrity. We do not yield to performance. Panel discussions were instant. Pundits parsed every syllable. Some applauded his restraint. Others called it hollow. Too little. Too late, one political analyst said on live TV. He spoke of patience while the ground beneath the courts is shaking. A firestorm of op-eds followed. One conservative outlet hailed the speech as a return to form. A progressive columnist wrote, "He looked the American people in the eye and said nothing they hadn't already heard." And in federal courthouses across the country, the speech landed with a different kind of weight. It wasn't just noise, it was a warning. A line drawn in polished marble. And judges, many of whom had once dismissed Jasmine Crockett as an opportunist, began to feel the air shift. Some read the speech and nodded. Others read it and quietly panicked, because they knew what came next. This wasn't just about Judge Pierce anymore. This was about a system that had gone unchecked for too long, and a politician who had just proven the public was ready to check it. Group chats between magistrates filled with speculation. A district judge in Illinois emailed her clerk to audit the last 6 months of discretionary rulings. A magistrate in Arizona canceled 2 media interviews he'd previously agreed to, citing optics. One retired appellate judge even posted anonymously on a private legal forum. Roberts' speech wasn't a defense. It was a signal. He's telling us to tighten the ship before someone else does it for us. In some chambers, that meant circling the wagons. In others, it meant preparing for scrutiny. Either way, the robe no longer guaranteed invisibility. Back in her office, Jasmine sat at her desk, reviewing the text of Robert's speech. She read it once, then again. No emotion crossed her face. She didn't need a team to explain it to her. She understood exactly what he was saying. This wasn't a dialogue. It was a deflection, an attempt to reframe the issue as theater rather than substance. But Jasmine wasn't interested in theater. She was interested in truth, and truth wasn't offended by scrutiny. It demanded it. She placed the paper down, exhaled slowly, and turned to her senior aide. "They still think this is about one speech," she said. "It's not. It's about years of silence, years of assumptions, years of power no one dared to question." She rose, pulled a new folder from her briefcase, and opened it on the table. Inside, 3 more rulings from federal judges involving emergency orders, sealed proceedings, and procedural shortcuts that had never seen daylight. "We're not done," she said. "Not even close." The morning after Chief Justice Roberts' speech was supposed to calm the waters, it became clear that the storm hadn't passed. It had only moved, and Jasmine Crockett was standing directly in its path. She had stayed silent just long enough for the headlines to settle, just long enough for every editorial board and Sunday panel to ask, would she back down now that the highest court in the land had spoken? The answer came at 7 a.m. sharp, when her press secretary sent a single-line statement to every major outlet. "Congresswoman Crockett will address the nation at 11 a.m. from the Capitol steps. Be on time." No one knew exactly what she was planning to say, but by 10:30 the air was already electric. Dozens of cameras were set up in rigid rows. Reporters paced in shallow loops, whispering predictions. Congressional staffers peeked from windows across the street. Even C-SPAN, usually last to the party, had gone live. And then, silence. Jasmine emerged from the front doors of the Capitol, not flanked by a security detail or a swarm of aides, but walking alone. She wore a dark navy suit, hair tied back, eyes locked forward. In her right hand, a manila folder thick with printed reports. In her left, nothing. No notes, no phone, no script. She stepped to the podium without hesitation, adjusted the mic once, and began. 3 men, all flagged by ICE, all linked to criminal networks, all nearly allowed to stay on U.S. soil, not because they were exonerated, but because one man in a black robe said so. The first sentence landed like a shot across the bow. Cameras clicked wildly. A few gasps escaped from the back of the crowd. Jasmine's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Her calm was sharper than anger. "Let me show you something," she continued. She reached into the folder and pulled out 3 documents, one by one, holding each up for the press to see. Each page had a photo, a summary, and a red warning box marked "Security Flagged." These are ICE risk assessments, not rumors, not anonymous tips. Government files reviewed by field officers. One of these men was arrested for arms trafficking in Caracas. Another had encrypted communications tied to a smuggling ring. The third entered the U.S. using a falsified identity. She paused just long enough for the weight of the information to settle. And still, they weren't deported because Judge Malcolm Pierce issued an emergency order without reviewing these documents. No hearing, no cross-check, no accountability. She placed the files down, slowly, precisely, and looked out over the sea of reporters. This isn't about one ruling. It's about a pattern, one where judges, unelected, unaccountable, can override national security protocols with the stroke of a pen. No vote, no review, no risk assessment. For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against boom mics. No one moved. Jasmine took a breath, then went further. "I want to be clear. This is not personal, I am not waging war on a single judge. I am confronting a structure that allows silence to carry more power than scrutiny, a structure where sealed courtrooms, midnight rulings, and judicial anonymity have replaced transparency. She reached back into the folder and pulled out another document. It was shorter, a single sheet of legislative language. She held it up. Today I am introducing the Federal Judicial Oversight and Transparency Act. It will require independent review panels for all emergency immigration injunctions. It will mandate that national security reports be considered before any ruling halts a deportation. And it will force public disclosure of sealed emergency decisions, because secrecy does not equal safety. Gasps turned into buzz. Journalists began frantically texting producers and editors. Live captions struggled to keep up with her pace. She pressed on. I am also formally calling on the House Judiciary Committee to open a bipartisan investigation into the use and abuse of emergency rulings in immigration cases over the past 5 years. We need to know, how often has this happened? How many times has one man or one woman overturned the will of elected agencies without oversight? Now, the tension in the air was more than political. It was constitutional. Jasmine was no longer just making a point. She was rewriting the rules. She stepped back from the mic for a second, then leaned in again. This time slower, quieter. Let me say it plain. If you're making decisions that impact lives, safety, and national security, you don't get to hide behind your title. The robe is not armor. The courtroom is not a bunker. The public deserves to know what's being done in their name, and who's doing it. Then she stepped away. No questions, no handshake, no photo op smile. She walked off the stage the same way she'd arrived, alone, confident, unshaken. Behind her, the wind caught the edges of the ICE documents still resting on the podium. The camera crews zoomed in. One reporter whispered to another, "That wasn't a press conference. That was an indictment." And across the country, in federal courtrooms, chambers, and legal institutions that had long operated in comfortable silence, something shifted. The robe no longer guaranteed silence. The bench no longer guaranteed distance. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just questioning decisions, she was questioning the foundation they stood on. The press conference landed like a seismic tremor, not just in the media, but in the judiciary itself. By that afternoon, law clerks across the country were quietly instructed to double-check rulings. Courtroom calendars were cleared. Emergency orders were paused for procedural reevaluation. But one building felt the aftershock most: the federal courthouse in downtown D.C., where Judge Malcolm Pierce had ruled for over a decade. His office blinds stayed closed that day. His staff didn't return calls. There were no statements, no clarifications, no televised defense, only silence. And in Washington, silence means something is about to break. It came not in the form of a grand apology or dramatic resignation. It came as a 4-line press release, dropped late Friday evening when most reporters had closed their laptops. It read simply, "Judge Malcolm Pierce will be taking an indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately. This decision was made to avoid further disruption of the court's operations. All active cases will be reassigned. No further comment at this time." That was it. No admission, no explanation. Just a man stepping backward, hoping the shadows would swallow the fire he left behind. But the timing told the story. Less than 24 hours after Jasmine's press conference, less than a week after the leak, and only days after Roberts had tried and failed to steady the bench. Behind the scenes, the tension was palpable. Some judges saw Pierce's departure as necessary damage control. Others whispered that it was the beginning of something worse, a precedent, that if one federal judge could be forced into hiding by a single congresswoman and a stack of documents, then none of them were truly untouchable anymore. A district judge in Boston reportedly said to his clerk, she didn't need to unseat him, she only had to expose him. And in group chats, private forums, and long, careful email threads, a new emotion crept into the black and white halls of justice. Fear. Not fear of Jasmine, but fear of the public. Fear that the age of quiet rulings had ended, and the era of consequence had begun. Jasmine, for her part, didn't celebrate. She didn't tweet. She didn't smile for cameras. She simply walked into her office the next morning, closed the door behind her, and sat down. Her staff waited for some reaction, a nod, a sigh, anything. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence at the top of a blank page. The system blinked. Now what? Because she understood something no headline had captured. Pierce's leave wasn't a victory, it was proof. Proof that power will always retreat before it reforms. Proof that silence only ends when someone forces the room to listen. And above all, it was a signal that her work had just begun. The announcement of Judge Pierce's indefinite leave didn't end the tension. It unleashed it. His exit, understated and carefully worded, was never about remorse. It was a shield. One last move to absorb the blow Jasmine Crockett had delivered. But across the judiciary, the impact was immediate, visceral, and silent. Judges weren't talking to cameras. They were talking to each other, behind closed doors, in long, cautiously worded email chains and impromptu conference calls when no one outside those marble walls was supposed to know about. What had started as one woman holding up 3 ICE documents had now triggered a quiet but profound reckoning inside America's most insulated branch of power. By Tuesday morning, judicial chambers in more than a dozen federal districts had blocked out hours of their calendars for internal protocol reviews. Some tried to keep it quiet, calling them staff development discussions. Others didn't bother hiding it. In the Southern District of New York, a senior judge called an emergency meeting with every magistrate in her building. Doors were locked, phones off. Inside, she laid it out without spin. "We need to audit our last 18 months of emergency rulings," she said. "I want eyes on every sealed order. If there's anything in there we wouldn't want on the front page, it shouldn't be there." No one argued. No one rolled their eyes. The message was clear. The era of quiet confidence was over. In Los Angeles, an internal email chain among immigration judges began circulating at 5:42 a.m. Subject line: Pierce fallout. Are we exposed? Attached were 5 PDF files, sample rulings, precedent memos, procedural guidelines. A judge in Houston shared a spreadsheet of every expedited injunction he'd signed since 2021, color-coded by level of public visibility. In Seattle, a district judge sent her clerk to reread the court's entire emergency docket going back 6 months. Her instruction was blunt. If I missed anything, if I skipped a single verification or cut a procedural corner, I want it on my desk today. But the conversations weren't just about logistics. They were about fear, not of Jasmine herself, though her name was spoken in every meeting, but of what she had unleashed. She had shattered the illusion that the judiciary stood above scrutiny. And more importantly, she had shown the public where to look. One judge in Boston reportedly told his peers, "We've gone decades without the public caring about how we make these decisions. That's over. They're watching now. They have the receipts, and they have her." The room had gone silent after that, because it was true. Some judges tried to push back in subtle ways. A few drafted internal memos defending past rulings preemptively, preparing for the possibility of oversight hearings. Others tried to dismiss the moment as political theater, an overreaction. "This won't last," one magistrate in the Midwest muttered in a side conversation. "The news cycle will move on." But the nervous glances in the room told a different story. The news cycle might move on, but Jasmine wouldn't. And the public that had rallied behind her wasn't made of pundits. They were retired law enforcement officers, working-class parents, veterans, former defendants, people who finally felt like someone was speaking their language inside the walls of government. In Washington, the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, the nerve center of federal judicial policy, quietly began collecting internal reports from all circuits. Not for public release, not yet, but as a risk assessment. Behind the formal language and soft phrasing, the intent was unmistakable. Who else might be exposed next? One internal message to chief judges across multiple districts read, "Review all use of sealed emergency orders since 2020. Flag any with national security implications, immigration, or risk classification deviations." Translation: clean your house before someone else kicks the door in. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent, at least in public. But her office was busy. Her team received anonymous tips from courthouse clerks, quietly pointing them toward cases that had been sealed with minimal justification. A retired judge even left a voicemail under a blocked number saying, "I wish someone had said what you're saying 20 years ago." Inside her inner circle, the atmosphere was tense, but focused. She wasn't celebrating. She was tracking, watching the system twist, tighten, self-audit, and expose itself. She turned to one of her senior aides late one night and said, "They're not afraid of Congress. They're not afraid of journalists. They're afraid of sunlight. And we just opened the blinds." The judiciary was no longer simply reacting. It was retreating. And in that retreat, the quiet turned strategic. Reports of internal reviews, judge-to-judge briefings, and back-channel legal memos continued to multiply, but none of it restored the public trust that had been cracked open on national television. Jasmine Crockett had changed the equation. This wasn't politics anymore. It was perception, it was legitimacy, and Chief Justice John Roberts knew that if something didn't change, and fast, the damage wouldn't just linger, it would spread. So, 1 week after Judge Pierce stepped away, Roberts made his move. No press releases, no public invitation, just encrypted emails and after-hours phone calls to select chief judges from key circuits, 2nd, 5th, 9th, D.C., and a handful of trusted voices from influential district courts. The location? A private judicial retreat center in Northern Virginia, usually reserved for ethics training in closed-door symposia. The purpose? Not reform, not yet, just containment, just control. At least that was the plan when they arrived. They gathered in a windowless meeting hall. 15 judges, each seated around a thick oak table beneath a chandelier that flickered with the weight of history. No transcripts, no recordings, only silence, guarded stares, and the knowledge that they were no longer invisible. Roberts entered last, a man visibly aged by the last 2 weeks. He didn't sit. He didn't greet. He walked to the head of the table and placed a single folder down in front of him. Then, without ceremony, he began to speak. "We are here because the robe is no longer enough, because one member of Congress and a few pages of truth have done more to rattle this institution than decades of legislation ever could." A long pause followed. No one interrupted. "And while we may disagree with her method, we can't ignore her message. Because if the public has lost faith in how we operate, then the failure doesn't rest with them. It rests with us." The words landed like a cold slap to the room. One judge shifted in his seat, another folded his arms defensively, but no one objected, because deep down they knew. Roberts wasn't speaking as a leader trying to impress. He was speaking as a man trying to hold a line before it gave way completely. "We've allowed the culture of silence to become the standard. We've relied on tradition instead of transparency. We've used complexity as a shield instead of clarity as a bridge. And now that someone has called us out, we're reacting like we're under attack, when in fact, we're being asked a question we should have answered long ago." No one moved, no pens, no notes, just stillness. Then he delivered the line that would echo far beyond that room. "When the people lose trust in the courts, the problem is not the people. The problem is the courts." It wasn't an admission, it was a warning. The room shifted. Quiet murmurs rose. One judge from the Fifth Circuit pushed back gently, asking if Roberts was suggesting they open their processes to public review. Another asked whether this meant ceding control to Congress. Roberts didn't answer directly. He simply closed his folder and looked each of them in the eye. "I'm not asking you to surrender your judgment," he said. "I'm asking you to remember what gives it meaning in the first place. The people." And then, without waiting for debate, he turned and left the room. Behind him, 15 of the most powerful legal minds in the country sat surrounded by silence. Not imposed, but earned. The judges had their meeting. The Chief Justice had spoken. Memos were drafted, protocols reviewed, language rewritten. Behind closed doors, the system had begun moving, not with purpose, but with pressure. But outside those chambers, on the steps of power where cameras clicked and microphones hovered like vultures, the story wasn't told in documents. It was told in presence. And on a bitter Thursday evening, Jasmine Crockett walked through it. Not to speak, not to argue, but to be seen. She exited the Capitol just after 6 p.m., the city bathed in winter gold. The press was already waiting, not the circus of flashbulbs and shouting matches. Not today. Today they stood quiet, hushed almost. Two long rows of reporters, lenses lifted, not knowing what to expect. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. She didn't flash a smile for headlines. She walked directly between them, slow and steady, her heels clicking against the cold stone, like a metronome in a silent cathedral. The weight of the last 2 weeks hung on her shoulders, not in fatigue, but in conviction. This was no longer a battle. It had become something else, something deeper, something permanent. A voice from the crowd broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Congresswoman, what now?" She didn't look back, because Jasmine Crockett understood something that few in that moment had fully grasped. She didn't need to answer the question. She had already become it. Later that evening, inside her office, the lights were off save for the golden glow of the city bleeding in through the tall windows. Washington at night was quiet, from the outside. But Jasmine's mind didn't rest. She stood by the window, arms crossed, her breath slow, steady. Below her, the Capitol lawn stretched out like a chessboard left mid-game. Across the plaza, spotlights illuminated the marble pillars of the Supreme Court, casting long shadows over the ground like silent ghosts of past rulings. She stared through the glass, not at the buildings, but at what they meant, at what they could still become. Behind her, aides moved quietly, unsure whether to interrupt. A legislative draft sat on her desk, highlighted, annotated, ready. Phone calls from state attorneys, General blinked unanswered. Committee requests were piling up. But in that moment, Jasmine didn't need noise. She needed clarity, and she found it, not in strategy, but in memory of why this all started. A sealed court order, a plane on the tarmac, 3 names on a risk assessment sheet, and one question no one had dared to ask out loud. Who holds the judges accountable? She hadn't called for resignations. She hadn't demanded impeachments. She hadn't chased power with power. What she did was simpler and far more dangerous. She had forced the courts to look at themselves and then asked the public to do the same. And now the system was blinking. Across the country, signs of change had begun to emerge. Subtle, cautious, but real. In Minneapolis, a federal court announced it would begin publicly publishing summaries of sealed emergency rulings. In Houston, a judicial review panel was formed. Quietly at first, but later confirmed by a local news outlet. In New York, judges agreed to start requiring independent risk audits before approving emergency immigration orders. These weren't revolutions. They were acknowledgments. Acknowledgments that something had been broken and someone had finally held up a mirror. And that someone was a woman from South Dallas with a law degree, a spine of steel, and a red pen she used like a scalpel. But none of it came without cost. Jasmine had been called every name in the book. Dangerous, grandstanding, naive, divisive. Anonymous threats arrived by mail. Senate colleagues she once called allies avoided eye contact in elevators. A columnist accused her of shaking the very foundation of judicial independence for personal gain. She read it once, then slid the article into a drawer already filled with similar clippings. She didn't react, because she knew what those attacks really were. Symptoms of discomfort, of power forced to justify itself for the first time in a very long time. And yet, for all the resistance, there were glimmers of alliance. A federal magistrate from Oregon sent her a handwritten letter. "I don't agree with your tone," Ms. read, "but I agree with your purpose. We've grown too comfortable." A retired appellate judge left a voicemail on her office line. "You did something none of us ever had the nerve to do. You made the system feel its own weight." Even inside Congress, quiet support was forming. A coalition of freshman lawmakers had begun meeting weekly, asking the same questions Jasmine first raised. Questions like, why are emergency orders sealed by default? Why are judicial conduct reports buried in internal review panels? Why is independence confused with invisibility? Jasmine hadn't started a war. She'd started a conversation that couldn't be ignored. One of her aides entered the room quietly and set a folder on the windowsill beside her. "Public interest request," he said softly. "A high school in Pennsylvania. They want you to speak at their mock government summit." She smiled, just barely. "We're on the syllabus now?" He nodded. "Apparently you're the Judicial Accountability Unit." She chuckled, just once, the sound low and tired. But it was real. As he stepped away, she finally turned back toward her desk. The room was dim. The city outside pulsed with headlights and soft sirens. She opened her notebook and wrote just one sentence at the top of a fresh page. A question that had haunted this journey since the beginning, but now rang with even more urgency than ever before. If the law doesn't protect justice, then who protects you? She underlined it twice, then leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the words. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge, not just to judges, not just to lawmakers, but to the nation itself, and it would not go unanswered, not anymore. Thought for a couple of seconds, the city lights were still flickering across Jasmine's office window when the last committee message blinked onto her phone, and that soft digital glow becomes our handoff into the story's true endgame. The moment where fireworks settle into embers and meaning rises from smoke. In the silence that followed her storm, every threat scrawled in red ink, every headline calling her reckless, and every sideways glance in a marble hallway hardened into a single undeniable truth. Justice is not self-maintaining. It can be cornered, stalled, humiliated, or bribed into dormancy, but it never dies as long as a single voice is stubborn enough to keep asking why. Jasmine Crockett was that voice, surrounded by men in black robes, drowned out by centuries-old protocols, and ridiculed by pundits who confused calm speech for credibility. Yet she kept talking, forcing the law to look at its own reflection. The backlash she faced was proof of concept. Power only swings when it feels a real blade against its armor. Anonymous letters arrived with threats more graphic than any courtroom charge sheet, but none of them cut deeper than the institutional indifference that tried to fold her courage into a footnote. That's the first human lesson. Resistance wears ordinary clothes, and injustice rarely calls itself by name. It hides in procedure, thrives on fatigue, and survives on collective shrugs, until one person decides that silence is heavier than confrontation. In the ledger of public life, Jasmine paid the cost up front so the nation could collect the interest later. The second lesson burns with slower heat, unfolding in the quiet space between her press conference and Judge Pierce's retreat into indefinite leave. Authority is not evil, but it is never holy. A black robe can signal brilliance and discipline, yet it can also mask shortcuts, blind spots, and well-intentioned arrogance that turns parchment principles into paper shields. Pierce's downfall wasn't scripted by villains. It emerged from an ecosystem that prized speed over scrutiny and tradition over transparency. When a single unsigned order grounded an entire deportation flight, millions finally saw how thin the membrane was between civic myth and operational reality. That thinness matters because every unchecked decision, whether stamped, classified, or whispered in a marble corridor, writes a secret line in someone else's biography. A border agent second-guessing protocol, a family waiting for closure, a community wondering why the rules change in the dark. Jasmine's greatest act wasn't exposing one judge. It was forcing the system to document its own heartbeat in ink the public could read. She proved that reverence without review calcifies into ritual, and ritual without reflection breeds quiet catastrophe. In pushing the courts to audit themselves, she reminded the country that accountability is the most patriotic act a public servant can perform. Only by making the invisible visible can institutions remember why they were ever worthy of trust. Third comes the lesson etched in the sudden hush after Chief Justice Roberts' secret summit. Reform is born in discomfort, raised in conflict, and tested in daylight. When Roberts finally admitted, if people lose faith in the courts, the problem is the courts, he wasn't surrendering. He was translating Jasmine's accusation into judicial vernacular. His words carried an indictment more piercing than any op-ed. Prestige means nothing if perception rots beneath it. The judges who sat around that oak table learned a hard arithmetic. Public confidence equals authority multiplied by transparency. Subtract either, and the product implodes. Their hurried self-audits weren't merely bureaucratic exercises. They were survival instincts belatedly kicking in. Jasmine didn't have to write their resignations. She wrote the suspense that cornered their complacency, and suspense is the most honest mirror power ever meets. The fact that robes rustled in fear proves systems can evolve when forced to breathe the same air as the people they govern. That oxygen is uncomfortable, but democracy was never designed for comfort. It was forged for course correction. A gavel only rings true when struck against the anvil of public insight. Fourth, courage is rarely loud for long because the work begins after the applause. Jasmine walked past those reporters without a word because speeches had done their job. Now paperwork, policy drafts, and late-night coalition calls had to finish it. She understood that victory laps waste momentum and invite revisionist spin. Instead, she opted for presence over proclamation, turning silence into narrative tension the cameras couldn't ignore. That choice teaches us that heroism is less about volume and more about stamina, the willingness to trade instant vindication for systematic change. Her restraint mocked every critic who claimed she was chasing headlines. Real headline hunters never leave the microphone. By stepping away, she converted media frenzy into legislative oxygen, giving skeptical lawmakers space to study, absorb, and finally adopt pieces of her transparency agenda. The lesson sticks. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is the one you decide not to say on camera, so it can echo in the rooms where laws are actually written. Measured silence can weaponize curiosity, and curiosity, once awakened, rarely goes back to sleep. Fifth, the story proves that individual resolve can destabilize institutional inertia, but only collective vigilance can rebuild trust. After Jasmine's crusade, small reforms sprouted: public summaries of sealed orders, independent risk panels, mandatory audit trails. Skeptics called them cosmetic, yet even cosmetic cracks widen under civic pressure. Each change engraved a precedent that future activists can point to. If it moved once, it can move again. That's how systems evolve, from jolts to increments, from increments to norms. The injustice Jasmine faced, smears, threats, procedural stonewalls, illustrates the emotional tariff every reformer pays. But it also shows the dividend, a nation's legal backbone bending a millimeter closer toward daylight. Progress may feel glacial, yet glaciers reshape continents given enough force and time. The public learned that oversight is not a sign of distrust. It's a declaration that the governed are awake. In democracies, insomnia beats complacency every election cycle. Sixth, outrage without blueprint is just noise. But blueprint without outrage collects dust. Jasmine married both. She weaponized public disbelief, then handed Congress a legislative map. That synthesis is the template for future battles over opaque power. Expose, propose, insist. It is easier to attack personalities. It is harder and nobler to overhaul procedures. She chose the harder path, absorbing personal blows so structural beams could be realigned. The unfairness she endured, mocked for ambition, accused of undermining patriots, framed as reckless, demonstrates how status quo defends itself by pathologizing dissent. Yet her steady campaign proved that fair process is not anti-institutional, it is pro-institution. She reminded America that honoring a system means demanding its best days outnumber its easy days. Anything less betrays the parchment we claim to revere. Seventh, transparency is not about spectacle, it is about stewardship. When those ICE documents appeared under studio lights, Jasmine didn't revel in gotcha theatrics. She treated them like exhibits in the court of public opinion, handled, read aloud, contextualized. That precision gave the story weight that rumor cannot carry. Information, when curated with discipline, turns spectators into stakeholders. Once the public saw the evidence, the conversation shifted from sentiment to standard. Should sealed emergency orders be shielded from independent review? Should risk profiles be optional? Those questions outlived the news cycle, embedding themselves in committee briefings and law school syllabi. Justice that hides breeds suspicion. Justice that teaches breeds resilience. The story's message is simple. When truth walks through the front door, power scrambles to reorganize rather than retreat. Eighth, Every citizen now owns a fragment of the outcome. The reforms inching through committee halls, the judges drafting clearer opinions, the law students studying this saga in real time. None of it would exist without the public energy Jasmine catalyzed. That energy carries a warning as urgent as her red-line documents. Vigilance cannot be outsourced. The courts, the police, the legislature, each holds authority only in proportion to the scrutiny it endures. If the people fall asleep again, the old shadows will lengthen. Jasmine's journey shows how quickly a single sealed order can erase months of democratic labor, and how equally fast-determined oversight can resurrect accountability. Democracy, then, is a contract renewed daily, written in ink but signed in attention. Neglect voids the warranty, vigilance repairs the cracks. Ninth and finally, the human heart of the lesson crystallizes in Jasmine's handwritten question. If the law doesn't protect justice, who protects you? It's more than rhetoric. It's a siren for every viewer who felt a chill as she walked silently between rows of cameras. The answer is both daunting and empowering. We do. We, the audience, the voters, the jurors, the readers, the quiet whistleblowers, the restless veterans, the anxious parents, the skeptical reporters. Justice is a chain whose strength depends on the least celebrated link. The unfairness Jasmine faced echoes the unfairness countless citizens meet when institutions close ranks. But her victory, partial yet potent, proves the chain can hold if even one link refuses to snap. In that refusal lies the ultimate takeaway. Laws are words, judges are people, and power is only sacred when it serves something larger than itself. The next time a sealed order threatens daylight, remember this story, and remember that silence is not safety. It is surrender. So let the image linger. Jasmine Crockett at her window, city lights bleeding gold across her determined face, no speech on her lips, only a question bright enough to outshine marble. That's the final beat, the human music under the legal thunder. Justice may travel through statutes, courthouses, and titles, but it breathes only when ordinary people keep watch. The story closes not with a gavel, but with a pulse, urging every listener to ask themselves one thing each morning. What am I doing today to keep the law honest? Because if we don't, someone like Jasmine will have to, and she has already paid enough for all of us. And now the story leaves her hands and lands in yours. Because what began with a sealed order and a grounded deportation flight didn't end in Jasmine Crockett's office or behind a courthouse door. It ends here, with you, with your silence or your voice, your doubt or your demand. She fought the system not to claim a title, but to reveal the truth, that justice is only real if someone makes sure it doesn't get lazy. She took the heat, carried the threats, was called everything from dangerous to naive, not because she was reckless, but because she refused to whisper what needed to be shouted. And now that the shouting has died down, the question lingers like a spark in dry grass. What are you going to do about it? Because the battle isn't over. Far from it. The emergency orders are still being filed. The sealed rulings are still sealed. The black robes still carry the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes deserved, sometimes not. Jasmine lit the torch, but one torch doesn't clear a forest. If you felt something when she raised those documents to the cameras, if you leaned forward when she said, "No robe should protect bad judgment," then you've already been recruited into the next chapter. This isn't a movie, it's not over, and watching is no longer enough. Ask your representatives what oversight exists for judicial discretion. Push for transparency in emergency rulings. Demand public logs of sealed orders. Because if the system fears daylight, that's exactly where we need to shine. You don't need a law degree to defend fairness. You don't need a podium or a camera to ask the hard questions. All it takes is refusing to look away when something doesn't feel right. The same way Jasmine didn't look away when that deportation flight was halted. The same way she didn't sit still when a judge's decision bypassed due process. She saw a breach in the wall and ran toward it. You can too, at your city council, your local courthouse, your next election. Look up your judges, read the rulings. Show up where it's uncomfortable, because the moment we stop paying attention, the silence comes back. And silence protects the powerful more than any law ever could. There is no cavalry coming. That's the truth Jasmine learned in the halls of power. No one is going to fix it for us, not unless we push, not unless we raise our hands, raise our voices, raise the standards of the people we let speak on our behalf. A republic is not a spectator sport. It's not a courtroom drama you stream between dinner and sleep. It is a contract. And every day you ignore the fine print, someone else rewrites it without you. Jasmine showed what happens when just one person reads the fine print out loud and refuses to pretend it says something it doesn't. So if you're waiting for permission to care, this is it. If you're wondering whether it's too late, it's not. But if we wait much longer, the damage won't be symbolic. It'll be written into law, because power, unchecked, rewrites rules in permanent ink. Jasmine fought to put a question mark where they wanted to carve a period. Now the ink is still wet, and it's our move. Call your representatives. Write your local court administrator. Ask how many emergency orders are sealed without review. Demand a database. Push for public oversight. Support legislation that brings transparency to judicial discretion. Share Jasmine's story. Talk about it at the dinner table, in your school, at work, online. Turn passive awareness into public pressure. Because the only thing more dangerous than a broken system is a quiet public willing to tolerate it. And finally, if you ever doubt whether one voice can crack stone, remember this. Jasmine Crockett didn't tear down the system. She made it look at itself, and that alone was enough to make it flinch. So now it's your turn. Make it flinch again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.